Well, this recording will be necessarily embarrassing, full of caveats and sort of stipulations of tentative uh, speculation because, anyway, this field is so complicated that this can't really be avoided. But I'm going to. Should be a pretty good summary of where I am in integrating metagram and metatype, apart from reverse engineering metagram, which is something that I'm doing concurrently with speculation around integration. Okay, so, and I won't get into all the details of trying to reverse engineer metagram because that is something that it's not even worth describing because of the state that it's in at the moment. But if I tried to describe it, it would just sound tremendously like gobbledygook. But anyway, I have some good avenues of making progress in that, and I might talk about sort of the next avenue of progress in that. But anyway, so one of the most problematic things about metagram, and this will sound almost crazy, is how to actually define what a metagram tone is, what an emotional tone is in the model in terms of metatype. Um, okay, where was I? Okay, so emotional tones. So emotional tones in the context of metagram. So I'll just say how I just generally conceive of emotional tones, and then I guess we'll see how well that slots in and fits into how I will talk about it. So how I've generally conceived of emotional tones is emotional tones can be used to make mental images, or at least can be used to uh, analyze mental objects and mental constructs, and in some sense are a way of stylistically describing the volitional content of thought forms. So emotional tones show a particular volitional spin that one has in one's purpose. It's a way of describing someone's purpose uh, uh, within a mental thought form, um, within a conscious object. And so it's a representative of one's one's sort of it's a it means something about the self. It essentially it's essentially saying that you are taking on an attitude in relation to a thought form, that you have a particular volitional spin on that is contextualizing the a particular content of thought. And so it's inextricably linked with an image of the self, or an image of one's own identity. So in this kind of definition, it is linked with the 17 model and not the 12 model. So I mean, in the explanation that I just gave is a kind of is a way of conflating the 12 model and the 17 model in some sense. Um, Actually, I shouldn't say 17 model. I should actually say just the meta type structure, which is the four sides of the mind interrelating with one another. So, in some sense, it at least what I've described seems to imply that it's not obvious that the self has to render some kind of um, self-image, that you have to have a reference of yourself, and so you can so you can dress that reference up with an attitude about what about uh, that is framing, or that is implied by a particular thought form. So you have an eye on yourself as you are expressing or um, proposing or contemplating or um, rendering a certain object in the mind. Uh, so it's a correlate to the content of psychology. So in terms of in someone's phenomenological internal psychology or schema, any content there is going to have a context that is something like the attitude um, of the thing that rendered it. So it's a stylistic way of coloring one's own expression of volitional thought. Anyway, now the reason why I say stylistic all the time is because this is a model of thought, of analyzing thought, or 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 psychological internal constructs within the phenomenological, sort of experience of one's own psychology, which means that I have to slot it into my model within the metatype model. Within the metatype is also another way of referring to the 17 model, because metatype is an overlay of the 17 model and shows what part of the 17 model is being used by one or other side of the mind, of the four sides of the mind. So it shows you where your four sides of the mind are over the landscape of the 17 model. And basically, emotional tones all have to do with the unconscious side of the mind. They only make sense in terms of the unconscious side of the mind. And that requires me to explain some basic metaphysics about my metatype model, um, and how that interacts then with the other side in the context of the other sides of the mind. Is that the reason why I call the unconscious is because you don't know what you do. That's how you know that you're alive to some extent as well, is that you're in a realm of action, you're in a realm of participatory, you do things that you don't know the consequences. You don't objectively know what you do. There's no also the status of the word objective in some sense. So the point of having emotional tones is to construct an objective paradigm, is to construct a set of, but is to do it with some, let's say, metaphysical sophistication and rigor and fidelity, that because I'm not saying that this is where this is not the consequence of the thought form, but this is the attitude of the thought form that is being implicitly revealed or tacitly espoused by the self that is producing it, and in some sense, it's even, I mean, this is perhaps not entirely true, but essentially, you have to kind of accept the model of emotional tones as being somewhat valid, um, because then I will say that there is only one side of the mind, or perhaps two sides of the mind, which actually believe in emotional tones, and in some sense, only one side of the mind really believes in emotional tones, which is the unconscious side of the mind. The other sides of the mind, the one other side of the mind that I was just talking about, might involve itself in emotional tones, but it doesn't truly believe in it. It's just doing it for the unconscious, because these two sides of the mind connect. The super ego connects with the unconscious side of the mind. Um, and so the unconscious side of the mind has this model of participatory attitudes and participatory spins. And so one's own, and I do think that you can experience emotional tones as emotions, as in some sense, but when metagram circuitry actually is set up fully, when you are using, anyway, I'm a little bit all over the place here. So these attitudes are like elementary particles, are like elementary shapes. And some of them have kind of chemical properties in terms of how they interact with each other. I might as well give at least one example here. Um, so and this needs to be reverse engineered, and so it's still a little bit tentative, but I mean, I've been working with this for quite a long time, so I do have some confidence in it, although I haven't reverse engineered it recently. Is that there are 4 groups of 6 emotional tones that cut across various different subdivisions, but these 4 groups of 6 have very special interactive properties in that 3 of the 6 will actually vie against one another. That it's like rock, paper, scissors, exactly like rock, paper, scissors. So 3 of the 6 are like rock, paper, scissors. But then each rock, paper, and scissors has a kind of consort, which is slightly different to the rock, paper, scissors, but in some sense, that consort, and I need to probably tighten up this jargon and stuff like that, but that consort is kind of like potential energy of the rock, or potential energy of the paper, or potential energy of the scissors. So I'll just give one example, is angry and confused. So angry is instinct with with trust, or dimension 1 with dimension 10 being amplified. So dimension 1 as the kind of as the base, and dimension 10 as let me just read out the long form. Experiencing a sense of what things will be like, distinguished by a stronger sense of what those things would be like. So instinct with extra trust added to it, with a stronger sense of trust. And then confused is instinct with an absent sense of trust, or dimension 1 with an absent sense, or a negated sense of dimension 10, experiencing a sense of what things will be like, distinguished by an absent sense of what those things would be like. And so anger is like the fuel that's actually, maybe, I mean, also quite obviously, in the sense of anger is trying to do something, and confused is the kind of listlessness of anger. So it's like, if you are angry, you are only going to be derailed if you are confused. And if you get into a state of confusion, then you are susceptible to some kind of rock, paper, scissors conversion, where you will maybe be subverted or diverted into somebody else's emotional tone of rock, paper, scissors, because in some sense they were entreating you into their rock, paper, scissors, but they are actually focused on their consortium to that correlating rock, paper, scissors, and then you kind of are part of constellating their emotional tone or something like that. Now, I shouldn't really necessarily say their emotional tone in any kind of strict possessive sense, because this can all be quite loose. This can all be quite intellectual. This is how participation happens in the lens of the unconscious side of the mind, is that one person is stylistically doing something and somebody else is stylistically doing something else, and sometimes there can be communication and interaction and in some sense diversion, but you might say that, well, it's not diversion, it's that someone was convinced, someone was persuaded, someone, sort of interacted with somebody else and worked out that their emotional tone had a better content, so it's not just in terms of style. So the style isn't determinant necessarily. The style is just a mechanistic medium or conduit or vehicle, but the content behind it, there's a metamorality behind these things, which is not explained through the emotional tones. The emotional tones is just a set of um, buttons, so it's sort of it's but there's a metamorality that's driving these things, which is beyond it, which is transcendent to it. And in some sense, the thing is that all of these states of potential energy and charge that is held within these stylistic attitudes, they're not they don't mean anything without that meta context in some sense. Um, and I would even argue that as they stand, they're always prone to continuing argument. They're always, in some sense, fundamentally tentative, which is why you're living in a participatory realm, which I call the unconscious, because it has no end. At least if you're going to ground the unconscious in emotional tones, which I do think is actually the most responsible thing to do. So, in some sense, my set of emotional tones aren't the principles that I believe govern the unconscious side of the mind and values that govern the unconscious side of the mind, but how you use these emotional tones are what allow you to, through the medium of the emotional tones, express and communicate principles and values, because this is just the medium, it's not the message. And I think that also some people can use emotional tones in a much more skillful way than others, because in some sense the best way to use emotional tones is not just to represent one position of a rock, paper, scissors, but to represent all three at the same time, rock, paper, scissors, simultaneously as a harmonic, because then you have a whole consortium, a whole chorus of angels as a full construct, and that will have a certain harmonic, and maybe somebody else will also produce a full construct and a full consortium and a full chorus of angels, and you will see that, oh, actually that one is quicker than my chorus, and so you switch to the quicker one, because in some sense it's not about because when you represent all three, it's not about winning in your particular lane, because you're not just representing rock or paper or scissors, you're representing all three simultaneously. So you're expressing emotional tonality in a kind of in harmonics, not in uh, um, okay. And when you use harmonics, I theorize that the actual meta context shines through, or is capable of being transmitted through the medium of these karmic objects, essentially. Okay, so now when I'm talking about metagram circuitry, that's somewhat different from just emotional tones. Metagram circuitry is emotional tones being used in the metatype in such a way that you are actually turning yourself into a puppet. You're turning yourself into an automaton, into a sort of a karmic robot that is is complicated, and I'm not going to be able to describe all the facets of this internal roboticism accurately, but one part of yourself is, in some sense, consuming another part of yourself, or potentially consuming another part of yourself. So there's a kind of internal rock, paper, scissors in one of the aspects. Or this might not be entirely true. This might need an external facilitator as well, which might also explain why some people, they need to associate with certain other people as well, to use it as a kind of internal bridge. But essentially, I'm actually getting ahead of myself. I shouldn't be talking about these mechanics, because these mechanics come in to how the second half of metagram development interacts with the first half of metagram development, and I mean that ontologically. And the first half of metagram development, man, this is confusing as well, because there is, I would even distinguish the ontological development of metagram circuitry and the epistemological development of metagram circuitry, which have two separate sources and have two separate narratives of how they grow into being, okay, or develop. So I'm working on the ontological right now, essentially. I'll just say that the ontological is all about the unconscious side of the mind. The epistemological is all about the ego, the propositional side of the mind, whereas the unconscious is the participatory. So you are actively embodying the behavior. You are tacitly, it is what you do. That ontologically ends up constructing this. So the first half is, okay, no, I have to add more context to this yet still. The reason why metagram circuitry establishes itself is because each side of the mind is having a really rough time with the other sides of the mind. And in some sense, it's not having a rough time with the other sides of the mind just innately. It's having a rough time because you have to live in the world. You have to experience and participate in the unconsciousness. And the unconsciousness has, let's say, usually speaking, a latent amount of trauma, which might in some sense be a kind of unavoidable suffering anyway, because karma is going to feel like it's some kind of attrition on some level. And so sort of the solution to this is to develop some kind of, I want to take that back slightly. Each side of the mind is fundamentally, structurally vying against the other sides of the mind in terms of where those sides of the mind are overlapped. And what is worse still is that the parts of the sides of the mind which are overlapped are literally uncomfortable and a source of instability and self-derailment of each internal side of the mind. So each side of the mind relative to itself wants to rid itself of one of its, because it's overlapped on both sides. So each side of the mind wants to take possession of some other sides of the mind's overlap with it at its beginning, but at the dawning, at the dawning of the preceding side of the mind, which is the end or the evening of that side of the mind, it doesn't like the evening. It really doesn't like the evening. It doesn't like the experience of the evening. And so it would like it if the new side of the mind could just stably take that evening away and hold it as its dawning. So that there can be a kind of eternal daytime for that side of the mind. Now, this means that you've got four separate sides of the mind which are constantly disrupting themselves or each other, because if one side of the mind changes something, it's going to have a knock-on effect on the evening of the preceding side of the mind. So as one side of the mind tries to sort of develop or mature or structure itself, it's going to have a structural imposition. So what is really needed is a compact, is a supporting, is a strategy of support. And so, like, structurally, what happens is if two sides of the mind can come together and occupy the ground which is the upsetting ground, of this one side of the mind's. Okay, this is annoying. I was just interrupted, so I'm not exactly sure where I was. But anyway, I was somewhere into explaining the. Now, this is going to be slightly awkward because I'm explaining the ontological development and formation of the first half of the metagram circuit, which is essentially what happens when the superego parent function is collaborating with the unconscious parent function in how it is going to occupy the subconscious inferior function. And so, which will then become the base of the unconscious parent function, which I also sometimes call the base, the death, or the beast. And so the reason why I call it the death is because this cognitive function that is the subconscious inferior function needs to be stabilized to support a protected domain of the subconscious. So if the subconscious inferior function gets occupied and stabilized into a kind of frozen attitude, then the subconscious parent function especially, but also the whole subconscious, can stably contain itself. It can stably rule its own roost because it doesn't have because it can work out a stylistic. It can work from a stylistic edifice. It can start to stably bully its base. It can start to lead its base and do so in a way and develop from its stable base, which I'm not going to talk about. But it can do whatever it wants in its own contained kingdom because now it's properly bounded. It's properly it's got a moat around it essentially because it doesn't have to worry about its own inferior function because it's been stabilized by these two collaborating external parent functions. Now, maybe collaborating might be the wrong word. So what's actually happening is that the unconscious parent function wants to come in here and do what it wants to the inferior function, because that inferior function is its own base. And so what I think is happening is that the superego parent function is first preparing the inferior function that it's performing upon and within with a certain kind of attitude. Now, I don't know if the superego actually is doing this authentically, is doing this for real. I wonder, I really wonder if the superego is capable of caring that much about how it's interacting in this inferior function. In some sense, I even believe that the superego is the procedural side of the mind. So it's like a machine. It doesn't really have a volitional sort of heart. It's just a kind of sorry, this might be the wrong place to make these kinds of descriptions about what's going on, but it'll become more clear in a bit. But essentially, I think that the superego is setting up an effigy in the theater of the inferior function of the subconscious. And then the unconscious parent function is coming in and taking that effigy, and it's converting it into an idolatry that is going to be the premise and edifice and support, or it's going to be the groundwork, the framing and grounding for, but it can only do so using the support of the effigy, which from its perspective is an idolatry. So the parent function of the unconscious needs this idolatry as a conditioning, teleological grounding, purpose, premise. So everything is made out of the condition that the attitude of this cognitive function is frozen in this attitude. And so it becomes an attitude. It becomes an image of the self frozen in an attitude. And that attitude is the conduit between the participatory side of the mind and the unconscious side of the mind. And so the unconscious side of the mind, the procedural side of the mind and the participatory side of the mind, so the superego, the procedural, and the unconscious, the participatory, are together coming together in some sense more so help the unconscious side of the mind stabilize its base, but also to tacitly support the subconscious in having its inferior function whisked away so that it can just do what it wants in its own little private kingdom, which is left sort of gardened by these extraneous forces around it. Anyway, now this particular, the subconscious and the ego have their own circuit, which is in some sense more sympathetic and more and it's structurally quite different from this first circuit, because the superego and the unconscious is, I think, the scaffold and the skeleton of the whole false ego complex. It happens first, and it's also more unique and more stable. So it really is the backbone of this whole thing, because the subconscious and the superego are complete. So I see them as two separate circuits. So you get the superego and the unconscious as one circuit, and the subconscious and the ego is another circuit. But they are helping each other because they mop up each other's messes. They fix each other. These two circuits fix each other's inferior functions for them. So there's this kind of indirect support that they offer to one another. But the support that is first provided by the superego and the unconscious is of a special variety because it's not internally circular. The subconscious and the ego, the subconscious flows into the ego flows into the subconscious flows into the ego. In terms of the superego and the unconscious, it's asymmetrical. The superego flows into the subconscious inferior function, and the parent function of the unconscious leads the inferior function. And on the other side of that, the unconscious parent function is creating an effigy in the ego's inferior function, and the superego's parent function is creating an idolatry out of its base. But ordinarily, if it was similar to the superego, if it was similar to the subconscious and the ego, that idolatry of that base would line up with the effigy from the unconscious, but it doesn't line up. They miss each other by one. So they don't hook up there. And so what the unconscious is doing in the ego's inferior function, I actually call the question. And this I actually think is what is in your head right now. Your thinking in your head, your ability to narrate thought, your ability to propositionally think through things is an expression of the question. And the idolatry of the superego is it's hard to describe it because it kind of, the question is in some way has an obtuse interaction with that idolatry, but that idolatry is kind of like, you could maybe see it as sort of like your own metamorality or your own law, or the pressure that you, like the limits and the boundaries that you feel that if you crossed over, you would be debasing yourself, you would be contradicting yourself, you would be sort of existentially degrading yourself, you would be acting outside of your own sort of psychological schema if you wouldn't know why you were thinking, why you're but in some sense it doesn't necessarily relate to the realm of contemplation. It relates to how you would judge your contemplation. So I actually call the idolatry of the superego over its own base. The function that base relates to in terms of the ego is the sin of the ego. Each other side of the mind has its inferior function and its sin whisked away, because when you cut out the inferior function, then the sin is the thing that proceeds after it. But the ego's inferior function is the question, and the sin is right there to be surveyed. Is right. You have a sense of the content of the sin, but it's not something that you think. It's something that you think that you'll be judged, how your purpose and how your whatever you can put in your propositional contemplation will be judged by the content of the sin. Okay, so or by the attitude of the sin. But that attitude of the sin is, in some sense, the other correlate of the effigy that the superego is making for the unconscious parent function to lead, to use as its idolatry. So anyway, this is set up before it has an emotional tone circuit. Like, this is a potential tactic. This is a potential strategy of communicating between the sides of the mind, and how the sides of the mind have a will gravitate towards this organizational structure that I'm talking about, because it will be stable, and because each side of the mind will take on a stable characteristic sort of sense of conserved constitutional order. When I say constitutional, I mean that it will have a clear sense of itself. Okay, because then it can stop sort of internal skirmishes against from because if you don't have this kind of relay system, if you are hounded by your own inferior function, your own side of the mind, in terms of its parent function, but also in terms of its dominant function, will have no structure in its dominant function that it will be able to express its child function or its motivational drive. So you need an edifice around which to have a stable strategy that allows you to elaborate and embellish or develop or express the tendencies of so. And this is the difference between a very young person and an older person. That a very young person will probably at some point will have the unconscious superego circuit set up. They will have one emotional tone that sets this up, because you need to have this emotional tone before you work out what the subconscious and the subconscious and the ego is going to have its own development of its metagram circuit, but it will be curtailed, or it will have the spectrum of possibility truncated by what the first half of the metagram circuit sets itself. So if and so I have this theory as well, that the superego and the unconscious parent functions that are performing what I call the primary counteroffer, which is the effigy from the superego parent function, which is then the groundwork for the idolatry, which the unconscious parent function wants to use the effigy for. And the reason why they need this stability, they need this negotiated agreement, is because this will unlock the subconscious to start being an independent being, to start being to have a nicely delineated kingdom of its own, to start to grow and mature and develop. So the primary counteroffer needs to be an emotional tone attitude as an effigy, which then is yes and that the unconscious parent function says yes to that effigy, and it's an idolatry. And that yes and is the same attitude, is the same emotional tone. And because emotional tones aren't themselves content, you can do this. It's a way of disguising disagreement. It's a way of conflating by creating a bit of death, a bit of beastly conditioning, that you are conditioning the inferior function that is housing this image of the self, that is the attitude of the emotional tone, is a bit of crystallized death. And the reason why I call it the beast and the death is because a beast is conditioned by its environment. It's imprinted upon. It only moves by fear or hunger or some passion of lust, or it's only moved by its passions or fear. It's completely it's like a completely reactive it's stuck in just employing different scripts. It's like if you were an emotional tone, you would be beset by the sea of rock, paper, scissors. You could only deal with rock if you conceived of yourself as identifying as a particular emotional tone. Then you would just become the sea of of being reacted and catalyzed and propitiated by environmental signals and triggers that were just all other elements of rock, paper, scissors. And this is why I've often thought that my metagram circuits themselves could even be used independently as a kind of therapeutic tool. If you just understood all the emotional tones, you would naturally work out that you had a proclivity towards some emotional tones, and more importantly, that you had a kind of antagonism or a kind of uneasiness with other emotional tones. And if you could just kind of work out the feng shui or the tai chi of how these emotional tones could be massaged in terms of how you could learn to use each of the emotional tones, then you might sort of extend your vocabulary, extend your because then you could, because anyway, but this has to do with environmental participatory stuff, which this is a secondary thing that I need to talk about later. But essentially, if you could desensitize yourself to being antagonized, or then that might mean that this death, this beast, was being forced to face time in a meta morality, to start taking a more meta moral perspective, and that could also sort of get you out of the reactive circuit. But anyway, I do think that it's important that I do think in some sense it's probably important to develop a false ego complex and to develop a metagram circuit. I think that you have to use a bit of an analogy, is that you have to be cast out of the Garden of Eden in order to return later, not to the Garden of Eden, but to the New Jerusalem, to the kingdom of God, which has inside of it the tree of life. But it's not the same as the Garden of Paradise and the Garden of Eden. It's you had to go through this, the mystery of the unconscious, the mystery of the participatory unconscious. Anyway, I'm not going to elaborate too much on that because it's too much of a tangent to what I want to focus on. But okay, so when the unconscious side of the mind, in its dominant function, has a handle on its own base, that it actually names its own base, which it names its own idolatry, then you have one half of the metagram circuit, and that emotional tone will have only certain combinations that it corresponds with, and there might be more fluidity than what I'm seemingly describing, because it might be that the subconscious emotional tone needs to actually develop an emotional tone. You see, I haven't even looked at this. I need to analyze this or whatever, but there'll be some kind of relationship, and that relationship might be essentially that it is a non-relationship, that the emotional tone that the subconscious parent function is using maybe has to be exactly non-reactive to it, or if it is react, but there's certain patterns, there's certain formulas. But anyway, my mind is not there. Um, but but there is a certain antagonism, I think, between the primary counteroffer emotional tone and the emotional tone that is used as the base of the ego. And so there's an internal antagonism between the primary counteroffer and what I call the emergent response. And this is necessary, I think, for the ego to actually assert itself as an independent um, entity that is distinct from this other circuit. And anyway, so in some sense, the unconscious is slightly colonized by the superego. Where and when people think of themselves as an independent as a the superego in some sense is really, in terms of the maybe some unconscious metamorality, there are some aspects to the superego which really make it like the god of the world, which is another name for the devil. Uh, um, because it's sort of like it's the guy controlling all the things behind the curtain. It's sort of the Wizard of Oz, um, sort of conducting the self delusion. So really, you sort of the spirit of man controlling things. And the way to transcend these things is to develop a kind of metamorality, and anyway, I don't want to talk too much about sort of general spiritual themes, but anyway, but the ego really has to find a way of claiming its life from this decrepit, sort of suboptimal, sort of epistemological. Well, anyway, so the ego is ontologically subverted, but epistemologically it has its own set of accounts. It has its own anyway. It's on a separate circuit, but that circuit is fundamentally directed and connected to the unconscious development of this emotional tone. So it's indirectly set up. It's in the same way that Neo. You could argue, is Neo in the movie, in the full set of you have to watch all three movies to get what I'm saying here, of the Matrix. It is said that the Oracle is the mother of the Matrix by the architect. But and I believe that the mother here, or the Oracle, represents the unconscious side of the mind, the mystery of the metamorality that is beyond all of these systems of control and karma, etc., to use my analogy. The real question is the Oracle Neo's mother? I mean, in some sense, the point of the Oracle is that she loves her special children and that she created the Matrix. She mothered the Matrix to produce these special children, of which Neo is one. But what makes Neo Neo, what makes him the one, is that he is the one to gain real independence and to break the system of control, or to transcend, not to break it in some strangely revolutionary way. When he does break it in the revolutionary way, we see him on the crucifix. We see him go to negotiate some real politics, some real metamorality with the captors of the system, which he does not command out of force. He commands because there is a mutual respect, because that is the true essence of the one, is that it's a form of fidelity and integrity to its, even to the internal machining aspect of the superego. And obviously, the connection here is that the machine world and the unconscious, the oracle, are deeply connected to begin with, that they devised this at the start, the first half of the metagram circuit, the backbone, the scaffold of this whole project, so that the independent ego could emerge, so that it could create its own epistemology, its own. Anyway, okay, so that's a way of describing it in narrative. Okay, I'm going to stop talking about this in general terms and just talk about some other aspects which are important here. So, the question is the unconscious creating an effigy in the ego's inferior. So, I mean, I called it the question. You might also call the question the mystery as well, perhaps. You could call it. But I mean, it is important maybe to slightly distinguish it from the unconscious, because it is the unconscious playing itself out in the theater of the ego. And one of the aspects of this question, and I think this is where my, I don't know how to even name it here, but when I talk about the primary counteroffer and the stimulus and the emergent response, each of these things are made up of two things. Like the primary counteroffer is made up of the answer and the prayer. The answer is the effigy of the superego, and the prayer is the idolatry, which is happening in the theater of the subconscious inferior function, which is, being whisked away from the subconscious to help the subconscious have its own kingdom. Okay, so, and you can also see the parallel between that and the matrix itself, in terms of the matrix in the matrix, the control system, or the scaffolding of the control system. Anyway, but the question, which is, the question is, I've already said, is your stream of thought, is your stream of consciousness, your the narrator in your mind that actually thinks things. Now this is going to be a bit strange to say, but essentially, how the ego, how that narrator, how does that experience the emotional tones? Because the emotional tones really belong to the unconscious side of the mind. They don't belong to the ego, but they do have a cadence. They do have a rhythm, which is the background beat, the background rhythm that is being played non-stop in the question. It's innate. It's inculcated within the question, and the thing that is inculcated within the question is what I call an implicit propositional ordering. And this implicit propositional ordering is an epistemological account of itself, an epistemological constitutional document that says that there is a particular thread of epistemology through which is the emotional tone circuit. So essentially, the question inculcates within it a script, which is a sequence of emotional tones. Now, the sequence of that emotional tones is not in the negotiation of between effigies and idolatries. It's made up of effigies. It's made up not of combined effigies and idolatries. It's made up of either effigies and idolatries. So it's kind of like a so there's a rhythm, there's a cadence, which is a kind of an innate propositional ordering or an implicit propositional ordering. And this ordering is the order of epistemological investment and anchoring and truth. So propositionally, you are stuck in an emotional argument, but that it's not really an emotional argument, because it's in terms of your own propositional truth hierarchy, in that let me just explain how you would be impeded by it, or how it would affect you. Is that it's as if you are making an emotional argument, that has premise 1, premise 2, and then that has a sub-conclusion, and then you have, from the sub-conclusion, you have another premise and another premise, and then you have yet another conclusion, and then you have another premise and another premise. And so because you have these links, some links are more primordial than others, are more basic than others, are more fundamental. And so you've got a chain of fundamentality. Man, there are easier ways of describing this, but so that's because what I just said with all these premises and sub-conclusions, it's similar to that, but it's not. But that's not a perfect analogy. So the confusing thing as well is that somehow the sequence of these emotional tones, the cadence of the sequence, or it performs a kind of rhythm that orders the question, or that. And so the problem is that this doesn't necessarily make propositional sense, but it is I think they call them workflow. It is a model workflow. And if the question deviates from this model workflow, the emotional logic, or the fundamental rhythm and the sequence, starts kicking you back, starts kicking your propositional thought forms. So if you have to become regimented in your question, in your narrative script, and if you don't pay the boatsman, you don't graduate to the next stage of the workflow. And so if you do this, you lose. If you don't do this workflow in the question, you lose track, you lose sight of your own internal fidelity to your own, eventually to your own backbone. Although, ironically, your backbone is dispersed throughout the workflow. So the actual backbone, in terms of the unconscious primary counter offer, and with the superego colluding on the single, which is the backbone itself is not in the ordering of the workflow, is not at the base, because the epistemological perspective of the ego is not the same thing as the ontological grounding of the structure itself. It is independent. Okay, so you kind of have this self-conditioning, this necessary self-conditioning, and we see in the Matrix, Neo is learning to bend the Matrix, and you can bend some rules and break others, but you can also maybe that at some point you can have sort of complete command over it, but then you're completely in the realm of metamorality, because then what are you doing it for? What should you be doing in that realm? And it turns out that I guess what you should be doing is not fighting with Agent Smith, but letting him assimilate you and then beating him from the inside. But anyway, that's a synthesis of a lot of things that is probably the symbol of overcoming the beast itself, or identifying with the attitude, with the emotional tone. Anyway, at some point the metaphor is not that useful, because it needs to be properly cashed out in terms of the model that I'm explaining. Okay, so the question has this cadence in it, it has this workflow in it. Now, I would argue that if you have another way of regulating the internal communication between each side of the mind, and you have another form of mastery over the sides of the mind, that you would be able, you would no longer need to be beholden to that workflow, because you would have an ulterior form of internal regulation. So I'll just say that, and move on to some degree. So to some in some issue, because I mean I'm talking about how sides of the mind communicate with one another, how they translate and sort of relay between each other and things like that, and the structure of the kind of coordination that exists between them. But in terms of substance, in terms of content of psychology, not so much, because I mean this is all about talking about the style of thought forms and things like that, is there is a problem here, which is that the superego is projecting an attitude. Well, it's not actually it's not an emotional tone attitude. It's not. So the question has a workflow, but the workflow itself is kind of a rhythmic sympathy with the emotional tones, but it is itself, in some sense, it's like telling to a child, you're allowed to be creative, you can do whatever you want, but you only have these crayons, these are the colors that you can use, and by the way, if you use one color, you must use this other color, and then you must use this other color. You can't pick and choose whichever color you want to use at any time. You have to revolve it in this particular order, but you can draw whatever you want. You can still draw whatever the hell you want. But after you use that color, if you want to switch colors, you can't choose whatever color you want. You have to go to the next color in the workflow, in the sequence. So that's actually a pretty good analogy. But anyway, that's what's happening on the one side. That's the most free side that you have. The most unfree side that you have is that your superego parent function is projecting and only itself on the sin of the ego, which is becoming, it's like this is the judgment that sits waiting for you on the other side of the workflow. So you're doing this workflow, you can do whatever the hell you want within the picture that you can draw or whatever, but you are being judged. You know that the art, you can't just do, well, you can do whatever you want, but you have a sense of how it's judged, and that sense of how it's judged is a real sense. Like this is the sort of the self-condemnation, or the potential of self-condemnation, which is in some sense coming from the other side of the superego, and we are not happy with it. In fact, when I say we're not happy with it, let me just say as well that it actually comes from our own internal metaphysic. But we usually experience it as external and environmental. The superego might as well be called the environmental unconsciousness. It might as well be. It is procedurally a metaphysical a priori correlate to the unconscious. That is how I would describe it, like philosophically. But how it is. It is. What is it doing? It's everything that it's part of the backbone. It's like the base of the backbone, and everything else that is happening in the false ego complex is has a correlate to what the superego parent function is doing, but it's not it's not a perfect one-to-one reflection, because it is actually this is mediated by the primary counteroffer, which is why I call it the primary counteroffer. It's mediated by the exchange between the unconscious parent function and the superego parent function, between the answer and the prayer, which is the same emotional tone, but it's only an effigy for the superego parent function. Well, it's the idolatry of the unconscious parent function. I mean, the correlate to this in the Matrix movies is that this is probably the architect. That the architect actually has to, he's the one who actually says, oh, the first Matrix was a paradise. We lost millions because no one accepted the program, because we actually needed, a grubby world. And so the superego is creating the dissatisfaction, the negative judgments, or the because in some sense you need limits. You need and those limits are not a direct reflection of the unconscious, because it is mediated by. This is why the primary counteroffer, I think, might be sort of the key to unlocking in some sense, so I mean, you go through all this development and you end up developing an ego that has a real sense of independent epistemology, an independent sense of self that's based on its own independent epistemology. But it can't be fully jailbroken until it rediscovers, until it explores and meekly quickens itself from the excavation of its own origin story and the excavation of its own ontology. And it has to overcome looking at itself in the mirror in this way. And it has to realize that at some ontological level, before the unconscious formed the edifice that the ego is standing on, because you see, the ego is standing on top of the ego. So when you look underneath the unconscious, sorry, what did I just say? I hope I said the ego is standing on top of the unconscious. But if the ego looks past the unconscious, it's looking past itself to some degree. When it's looking into the superego, it's almost staring into the abyss, and the abyss is staring back, and it can't, and it loses its sense of self, potentially. And then it has to develop within its metamorality, it has to develop a first philosophy that's capable of dealing with this absurdism. And this is why I talk so much about Nietzschean nihilism, and I talk about the profound work of Vasti Ruot, writing on nihilism, as writing in her chapter called "Living with Nihilism," which is an excellent academic paper that really is the full synthesis of Nietzschean, of the solution to the puzzle that Nietzsche was exploring. But that he kind of gave a picture of the solution, but in philosophy you need someone to synthesize it, to fully understand it, and there it is written out. But and there's also another explanation of this, although not as directly as Vasti Ruot's work, in Catherine Elgin's Epistemic Agency, paper on epistemic agency, is also worth reading. But those are both basically on the. They are both. I can't say that they're saying the same thing, but what they're saying is definitely compatible, and also the one is more metaphysically broad, and the other one is more about how it functions. So the one is on the how, the other one is on the why and the what. So Vasti Ruot is telling you why and what you need epistemic agency, and Catherine Elgin is telling you how it works and how it's done. But anyway, this is a bit awkward for me to say because I don't have evidence, but I was actually instrumental in constructing both of those philosophical works. But anyway, that will just sound like a strange claim for plagiarism. But I mean, I might as well also at this point, after saying that, I've probably ruined this recording now. that I was also instrumental in the Matrix movies. But I mean, that just sounds like a crazy person. Let me move on. So the superego has to project a has to stabilize its own side of the mind, because really the superego, I mean, I call it the procedural side of the mind, because the essence of the superego is that it is like an a priori metaphysical framework, and you have to have a certain metaphysical pre-commitment in order to have an experience. So I mean, this is why I've even said that in some sense, look, I'm not sure if we are all just in our brain, if our brains are our subconscious perspectival structures collating them, or in some kind of materialistic substrate. But and maybe there is a representation of the superego in the brain structure, or maybe it's sort of stylistically intertwined with how the perspective of the subconscious relates to the superego. But um, so that, I mean, it might have some correlates to some kind of biological substrate, but anyway, or material substrate. But it really has to be understood as it has to be conceived of as on the level as being a metaphysical a priori grounding, or frame, or it's better to call it a framework. I mean, yeah. So you see, if it's a priori metaphysical framework, which then obviously, if you do have a metaphysical a priori framework, it is going to have some mark in your development of your subconscious, because it's going to be a fundamental grounding constituent that is part of the formulation of your perspectival brain structure, or whatever. So anyway, but anyway, the projection of this base of the superego, which is its own private idolatry for itself, to comport itself so that it can continue to deliver this effigy to the unconscious, or to deliver this effigy to the subconscious inferior function, because the subconscious does not want, in some sense, this is all for the subconscious to have its own private kingdom, so that it can be the help to establish the independence of the ego, anyway. Because the ego and the subconscious are kind of always in an exact tandem relationship that kind of develops simultaneously. Anyway, and eventually, when they develop enough, then they remarry, or they reintegrate with the unconscious, or the unconscious eventually maps them as being in this kind of fixed correlate after, which is, in some sense, that is what the rhythm that is embedded within the question. So anyway, so the question that I've kind of left unanswered here is how does the ego start having questions, or start having a question that propositionally penetrates the superego, and that is in some sense capable of integrating with the superego as well, because then you have harmony. You have an internal uh, I mean, I would generally link that with self-actualization, because then you're going to have a fully integrated. You're not going to have internally internally engineered uh, errors. You're not going to have. You're going to be able to have a kind of cogency um, that is a collaboration and concerted effort between each side of the mind. Um, but in some sense, the main thing about getting is the ego needs to be able to realize what how the superego is projecting its idolatry onto the base of the superego, which is the sin of the ego, because then the ego will have a way to stop sinning, or a way to producing the metaphysical preconditions that lead to the opportunity, because you see, sin, it's hard to describe what sin is, because sin is not a sin is about the framing of things. It's not about it. And so, in some sense, I mean, I'd have to. This now needs to become another recording about. but I'll give the mechanics of it. Is that the question, or the ego needs to be able to get its propositional attention and focus and control, but also responsible control and integration with the superego's dominant function, because it's going to be the superego dominant function, which I also think archetypally relates to the New Jerusalem, um, in terms of how, because if the question can understand the superego dominant function, it can preclude the the parent function in the superego from perpetrating this idolatry over its base, and it can let the base go. It can let the base be fluid and free and organic, and not be atrophied by this residue, not be bogged down. And that will essentially abate the sin. The thing is that because this is an a priori metaphysical, the work that I'm talking about is a kind of spiritual work, but because it's procedural and because it's connected with the unconscious, when it's seen in the context of the unconscious, no, what I said is half true, but it's related to that, but it's not probably the exact thing. But because this is an a priori framing thing, it's not necessarily going to be possible to do in the world. Because you can metaphysically have your own framework and you can live up to your own standards, but other people won't live up to those standards. And so you're going to have a judgment. This is going to result in a judgment on other people. Depending on how it's digested by the unconscious side of the mind. And how it's digested from the look. So what I just said is also only half true. It's not entirely true. Is that judgment is potentially going to be applied to other people, and so you're going to have to translate it into a participatory, unconscious sort of thing. So yeah, there's going to be a metaphysical. Um, uh, anyway, and this is somewhat cured by the technologies spoken about in the Christian doctrine of communion and being apart from the world, because then it's quite simply it doesn't really matter. Because the truth of the communion is in the communication of the metamorality, or within the shared culture of the metamorality, and then there's a kind of there's a direct. So I mean, if you read First John chapter 4, it's very clear that the distinction between the world and the spirit, and the distinction between the truth and sort of you know people hear us, and people that are of the world can't hear us. They don't hear us. They only have ears for the world. They only hear the world, and the world is so it's this kind of so in some sense there will be, let's say, there will be a practical inconvenience, uh, or, but it's a necessary state of affairs of having this distinction between the world and the spirit. Um, anyway, especially when you're dealing with the superego, which is essentially what I think that is happening there. But when you are intimately aware of these things internally, then that probably gives you much better handle on being able to. And there are also complicated things here because I mean, the communion itself, I think, actually produces real spiritual fruit. It actually makes you more able. It's because the spiritual gifts are empower each other through the communion, that this direct communication actually creates a nexus that is quicker and able to outpace and able to sort of lead captivity captive, as it were, um, in the sense that the spiritual purpose wishes to do so. I mean, people have a lot of strange ideas that that the kingdom of God looks like a particular empire, or looks like a particular sort of thing or that. Uh, when in the scriptures it's always spoken of as the little flock. That the multitudes. Anyway, I'm not going to get into preaching a sermon, but there is a very important distinction to be made between the spirit and the world. and the multitudes in the little flock. And really, the source of this is so important to get the proper expression of the meta morality in the unconscious side of the mind, because that is where you are spiritually beset upon or attacked or sort of degraded, or where you start degrading yourself and you start moving into a coping mechanism of sort of the emotional tone death or beastly atrophy of the inferior functions. um, but yeah, essentially, if the question then gains access to essentially enlarging itself into having full purview and integration with all the constituents of the 17 model of the whole, that essentially it's so well integrated that it can work with all these issues. But the real question is does it continue to emanate from the unconscious parent function into, is that really the thing that is the actual container of the mind? Does it, is that, I think the answer is yes. I think that is essentially maybe that is the basic particle of the soul, is that connection. And the spirit is the actual, and sometimes I invert these things. But I was going to say that the spirit is sort of the life of the contents, and the sort of the direction, the orientation that they are directed towards, in terms of where are they leading to, where are they going, what is the teleological purpose. And you can't judge the spirit by exactly its content, but where it's, what it's suggestive of, what its work. It's not the work that it represents, it's the workings, the group noun workings. When group nouns become sort of like adjectives, the book of life, in the book of life, people are judged not by their works but by their workings. Where is it leading towards? Like, what was the actual meta moral sort of thing? And that seems to be the basic vehicle that they have to get anywhere, or is the soul, is perhaps that particular thing that operates in the realm of the ego, in the propositional, the question. And so that might be the particular lens that a person has, is that they are expressing an effigy that this particular effigy I call the question. And I mean, that does line up with scripture, because sort of it's all about what you ask. It's what you ask. Knock, and the door will be opened unto you. Ask, and you will receive. So the question is not. The question is, what are you asking? What are you actually asking? Is kind of maybe a sort of deep question for an evangelist to dissect, but or to give you some edification. But anyway, I'm not quite an evangelist myself, but that's not really my gift. But anyway, okay, I think I've done a lot of work there. That's how I'm looking at things. probably have to make more recordings about the specific mechanics of the emotional turns that I still need to work on reverse engineering. Okay, this is an addendum to my last recording. I'm just going to talk about the superego primarily and talk about the effigy. So this is interesting because I think that the answer, it's literally called the answer, and in some sense, it's interesting that thematically this kind of maybe corresponds with the question, because this is the answer comes before the question, is the kind of, but the answer is the production of the effigy that is being housed in the subconscious inferior function, which becomes the base of the unconscious side of the mind, that is used as the idolatry that allows the unconscious side of the mind to reflect the effigy of the superego. So the superego, in some sense, is the thing that is really happening, is the thing that is procedurally, metaphysically, a priori, in the a priori framework, in terms of grounding what is happening in the kind of superego orientated procedural reality. Now, the superego doesn't necessarily care to make an effigy of itself. I mean, the superego performing in the theater of the subconscious inferior function is quite distant, is quite far away. It's quite a distance from the realm of the superego. The superego is a certain territory within the 17 model, but it's producing this effigy. And it's producing this effigy for the benefit of maybe the subconscious, but maybe also primarily the benefit of the unconscious. And for the unconscious to take control of that inferior function. But in some sense, it doesn't, the superego, for the superego to involve itself into craft, what the effigy is, it's the effigy of the parent function of the superego. So when the superego parent function is performing the effigy, performing the answer in this inferior function, it's saying, this is what I look like if I am projected into operating within the sphere of operation. If I am performing something over this cognitive function, which is the inferior function of the subconscious, which is to become the base of the unconscious, I am importing myself. I am projecting myself into operating over this territory, and that effigy of itself is there so that the unconscious side of the mind can use that as a premise for its own side of the mind, because it's very hard for something to premise itself. Something can't found itself very easily, so it needs this importation from this foreign gift. It needs this foreign effigy to idolize and to use as the construction of its idolatry. For it to reinterpret. So it's an exogenous sense of fundamental framing, which is in this case coming from the real source of ontological framing, an a priori metaphysical, because that is the basic quality of the superego, is that it's kind of this metaphysical framework of a priori, sort of structure. So that's what's being imported in the effigy of the answer. And from that, the prayer is the idolatry, which is how it's being animated, how it's being received, or how it's being, in some sense, it's almost like a communication between the effigy and the parent function that turns the effigy into an animated image. Sort of this is the skeleton that it is going to incarnate inside of and use like a puppet. So I call it an idolatry, but in some sense, it's not an image of God. It's an image of the self. So, but because the self is in the image of God, it's a secondary kind of idolatry. But essentially, it's a way of operating from a premise which you don't have to, within that own side of the mind, that you don't have to justify. Therefore, you can use it you can use it very fast. You can use it very fast and loose because it has an automatic um, built-in veracity that is essentially the burden of which is exported by the maker of the effigy, being exported from the maker of the effigy. So the burden rests on the maker of the effigy, which is the superego parent function. But now when the superego parent function is making this effigy and the unconscious is running with that baton has been passed, but it's the same baton, even though there is an exchange there's a handoff from the effigy onto the idolatry. There's a handoff there. That the superego parent function doesn't do this for nothing. It has to balance its own books. So the effigy is made at the price or at the cost of its own internal domain, is that it has to lead its own base, which also happens to be the sin of the ego. So, and I think I described the sin of the ego pretty well, but another word to use is cringe. It is your sense of when you are in a kind of when you're operating in a sense in which you're this is strange because it's sort of this is the part of the ego that is literally, this is a cognitive function. The sin of the ego is the base or the death or the beast that is the idolatry of that is the fundamental condition, the fundamental body that the superego uses. But in some sense, this body is not a body of the self, or it's a version of the self that is also the environment. It's solipsistic. This is why I call it a priori structure, because it's a universal sort of metaphysical projection, or sort of so the condition of this body, the condition of this death or of this beast, is fundamentally generalized in terms of one's propositional. It also, the sin of the ego, the sin of the propositional sphere of contemplation, is essentially what comes after the judgment that comes after the. But it's weird because how do you judge the propositional contemplative sphere or domain? It's like it comes after. It comes in. You can't place it in time. It's beyond time. It's kind of has an a priori metaphysical. It's an a priori metaphysical framing. So it's kind of eternally damned, or it's eternally cringe. So it's sort of so that it just doesn't work eternally, but in terms of that it doesn't. I mean, what sin means in the real sense is that this is going to be a bit sketchy to describe, but that, I mean, obviously the translation is that it's missing the mark, but the thing is that it's not just missing the mark, it's that the target is erroneously also kind of impossible to hit, but you can't really describe it like that because that would. You can't really say that it's impossible to hit. You can only say that it wasn't hit. Because to say that it's impossible to hit, you're making a meta judgment about it in the a priori space. So when you say that it's impossible to hit, that is a proposition that is impossible to clearly perceive. within the you can't ground that claim within a propositional framing. You can only ground that claim within a kind of philosophical resonance, or a kind of, sort of, you can recollect that, it's a philosophical judgment. It's a kind of metamoral ascription. But basically, so it's weird because I'm saying that the metamoral domain, the metaphysical a priori thing, is itself a corroded and broken sort of conundrum, which has a kind of dilemma built into it, in which it's not possible to satisfy two preconditions, which means it's impossible to hit the target. And so you end up missing the mark. So from the ego's perspective, it's missing the mark. But from the superego's perspective, it's like the boundary of cognitive dissonance. In the biblical language, there is a description of the cherubim that guards the way of the entrance to the Garden of Eden, and that it says that it keeps the way of the tree of life. And this cherubim is a sword, a flaming sword that turns every way, and the sword that turns every way keeps the way of the tree of life, so that man cannot gain access to the fruit of life and the tree of life. And so this is the sin of the ego, which is the idolatry of the superego, is that it's a cognitive dissonance. It's an impossible set of metaphysical preconditions that cannot be fulfilled, which in some sense encapsulates and distinguishes the viable contemplative propositional domain and what lies beyond that, which is simply cringe, because it just doesn't, it's not viable, it's not operable. It's like you're clearly trying to propose things that don't comport, or that clearly resonate with the idea that all your propositional space is arbitrary, capricious, or silly, or kind of just a kind of ad hoc, universal decadence, or sort of self-defeating sort of bit of nonsense. It's sort of it almost it conforms also with the general sort of a brain in the vat, sort of that God is really just a demon, or that it resonates with the kind of the versions of incomplete nihilism that kind of lead you into devaluing value itself, and all that kind of stuff, and that there's only sort of diversion and self-indulgence, or something like that, which is all fundamentally hollow. So it's a grand sort of nihilistic tumult. Anyway, so you can't. So in some sense, I think that the question has to find a way to untangle this puzzle box of cringe, but it can't do so. The question can't hopscotch, and maybe this contradicts some of my earlier models of self-actualization, saying that you need to import and export from the sin to the inferior function in the ego, which is what is housing the performance of the question, which is the thing where the question is being contemplated in that inferior function. I want to say that I was half right, that it's not that you do need to import and export, but not directly between these things. You have to go backwards through the ontological thread, that you have to get the inferior function or the question to connect with the sin, but not directly between themselves, but through the long way round, through the unconscious parent, through the subconscious inferior function, which is connected with the superego parent, with the answer in the prayer, and then from the superego parent via that conduit to the only itself, to the idolatry, that because then you confront the idolatry that it is performing, and it's like befriending the Wizard of Oz, and not just saying, oh, it was all just an illusion, but oh, these are actually this was the organ machine that you were using, the sort of the piano. I'm referencing the actual scene in the movie when the contraption, the man behind the curtain that is creating the illusion of the Wizard of Oz, the real Wizard of Oz, the man behind the curtain, has this piano with all these keys on it that he's pushing, and all these levers that he's pulling to make the smoke and make the hologram of the Wizard of Oz appear. And so you are debunking the sin from understanding it mechanistically, um, in terms of how it operates, and then you know the reason as well, because you know how it connects with your unconscious, essentially. And therefore, you're going to responsibly. Yeah, I did want to bring up this issue as well, that this kind of is an elaboration of what I was saying about the meta-morality to some degree as well, and about sort of the little flock and the multitudes to some degree. But this is a slightly sort of political comment perhaps, but you see, this is what is so toxic about the identity politics crowd, is that they want to abolish cringe, but they want to do it by universalizing their unconscious side of the mind, by projecting it onto other people, and by forcing people to sort of, because they don't believe in the distinction between the little flock and the multitudes. They believe that everyone needs to be plugged into the same program, the same universal enforcement, the same regimented, imposed order that makes sense. In some sense, it's like it's trying to do the work of self-actualization, but doing it through a collective, through a club, which is not authentically driven like a communion in a church is, with actual individual spiritual gifts and work, but through a kind of hypothetical, oh yes, let's just all just slot in, let's all just plug it in, rather than actually doing it through individuals that are members in particular, interacting and communicating directly. Um, and this, I think, is all by not having the distinction between the little flock and the multitudes. They have merged these things, and therefore they can actually conquer their own sin, but only by projecting that as a universal enforcement, because they don't have to subjectively negotiate and break the bread and communicate it directly. There must just be an automatic sociological enforcement of it, because there just needs to be a general conformity, and so there's just a kind of grift towards a lowest common denominator, and if anyone doesn't want to jump on that bandwagon and join that groupthink, then they have to prove a negative, otherwise they get quashed and beaten by the psychopathic mob, because they are conquering sin in this collective domain, in this dominion, in this sociological, sort of plot, which has this kind of strange sort of lowest common denominator that in some sense can't work, because they can only know that they're all on the same page if they're all persecuting the same scapegoat in order to facilitate it. So it's an interesting mockery. It's very interesting how this toxic ideology is quite an extensive mockery of roughly the process of self-actualization, or the internal steps that need to be taken. But but without important distinctions, that make the whole thing have no integrity and make it really quite a terrible mockery. Anyway, I'm going to have a recording next where I talk more about politics that will correspond to this as well. That might be quite interesting.